Hey everyone! This video is a response to one that I made over a year ago called Why Being Transgender Doesn't Constitute a Mental Illness. I recommend going back and looking at my gender and sex playlist before watching this, at least the first two videos. They contain some background knowledge that you may need to understand some of the content. A lot of people seem to have similar comments and questions regarding my last video, and I feel like some of them are worthwhile to respond to. Now keep in mind, I am not an expert on trans people. They are. And, in fact, they have a large body of work that spans over 50 years, most of which I'm not even going to be able to discuss in this video. However, I highly recommend that you go and look into what they are saying too, not just me. I'll leave a few links in the description to get you started. It was probably ill-advised of me to do a video on saying something is not a mental illness without having first defined a mental illness. One commenter was able to look up the definition of mental illness and came up with conditions that affect your thinking, feeling, mood, and behavior, affecting your ability to relate to others and function each day. Honestly, this is a pretty good definition for general usage, but when we're making criteria on deciding who to diagnose, we need to be more specific. One of the problems with using this definition is that we can classify normal human circumstances such as grief as mental disorders. In fact, the task force assigned to make the new DSM came up with clarifications for exactly this reason in the current rendition. Again, the DSM can be thought of as the Encyclopedia of Mental Disorders. The current rendition is the DSM-5. Keep in mind, it goes through new editions because it is imperfect. However, it is considered the standard for professionals. I may make a video another time explaining the various ways in which mental illness is looked at and defined. Although there is some consensus, there are dissidents, and for good reason. It is very political to classify someone as mentally ill. So, for this video, in keeping with the standard of professionals who have studied this longer than I'm giving you the definition they use in the DSM for defining a mental disorder. A mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. An expectable or culturally approved response to a common stressor or loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. Socially deviant behavior, political, religious, or sexual, and conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are not mental disorders unless the deviance or conflict results from a dysfunction in the individual as described above. So then comes the question, do trans people fit the description of being mentally ill? I'm going to get to the cognitive part in a second, so let's start with emotion regulation. Do trans people fit the description of having problems with emotional regulation? Is it possible to be trans and to not have problems regulating their emotions or feeling stressed constantly? It certainly is. Sure, some trans people have emotion regulation problems, but the fact that not all of them do means that you can't classify all trans people as being mentally ill just for being part of the category. Gender dysphoria does happen only to trans people, but not all trans people experience gender dysphoria. And again, gender dysphoria and gender incongruence are not the same thing. From the DSM, there are two criteria for gender dysphoria. A, cross-gender identification, and criterion B, aversion towards one gender. This means that you have to have aversion towards your own gender to be diagnosed. Not all trans people have this aversion. Some of them just identify with the opposite gender. Next, we ask ourselves, do people who are trans have behavioral issues? Sure, they can have behavioral issues like anyone else, but we have to prove that it's because of them being trans. I'm hard-pressed to identify anything that could fit this category. Cross-dressing and gender-conforming surgery are likely two things that come to your mind. However, dressing differently than social norms doesn't mean you are disordered. Go back to our original definition. As for surgery, there's no compelling argument that getting surgery itself constitutes a mental illness, as plenty of people who've gone through trauma have gotten cosmetic surgery, and we can't call them mentally ill. You'd still have to argue that it's because of an underlying illness. On top of that, not all trans people want surgery or to transition. So back to cognition. This is where it seems most people get hung up. I feel like cis people's issue is summed up by one YouTuber's comment. Transgenderism is the definition of a delusion. Now, this person was likely being disingenuous, but a lot of cis people do have variations of this belief, usually evidenced in discussions like this. Sex and gender are different, as I describe in detail on my video on the sex-gender distinction. To summarize, gender is a psychological phenomenon, not a physical one. Trans people do not believe that they have the genitalia that they don't. They don't believe that they have certain chromosomes when they don't. Trans people just identify with the other gender than what's been assigned to them when they were born. This is an innate personal experience that can be tied to one's gender role, but it's not always based on it. Lastly, in our definition of a mental disorder, we talk about how it has to cause significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. You have to show that being trans in all instances causes disability or distress in all instances of trans people, but it doesn't. You can be trans and live a nice and uneventful life just as anyone else. But if you have dysphoria, it can cause significant distress in these areas. And that's why the dysphoria is considered to be a mental illness. But again, being trans in itself is not a mental illness by the standards of the APA and the DSM-5 task force. This brings us to our next question. Is intersex a disability? I need to do a little aside before we get into this question. Most trans people are not intersex. Intersex people get brought up a lot in this discussion of trans people to show that even biological sex isn't black and white. And the thought goes, if sex isn't black and white, we have no reason to believe that gender is black and white. So to the question, is intersex a disability? In some cases, it can certainly be debilitating. Some variations can come with issues making or regulating hormones, and in other cases, intersex gonads can carry real cancer risk. A decent amount of intersex people can't reproduce. However, this does not mean all cases can't. Most intersex babies are healthy, and although many intersex variations have infertility, that doesn't mean all of them do. Keep in mind that some intersex people live average lives without even knowing that they're intersex. Most of us are never told our chromosomes and just kind of assume what they are. However, this question has something else going on implicitly. So if I were to answer without any sort of nuance and say that intersex is a disability, what does that mean? Does it mean that intersex people don't exist or somehow these conditions don't count? Certainly not. Maybe it's used as a justification for forced surgery, but that's been shown to do harm in itself. In fact, 2 state-level medical societies have made some resolutions stating that intersex people should be able to make decisions about their own bodies. The question itself seems to carry a value judgment, and that's why many people who are intersex don't like the term disorders of sexual development to describe their condition. Sure, some intersex people do have conditions that need to be looked at by medical professionals, but not all, and neither are less human because of it. I've also had some questions that amount to, how should you raise your trans kid as far as gender goes? Someone asked specifically,
if parents have a boy and raise him feminine, and when he's older he says, I am a boy, was that child abuse?
Well, you're definitely harming the child if that whole time you raised him femininely when he wanted to be raised masculinely. It's so obvious that it's harmful when we're talking about people who identify with the gender assigned to them. But this is how we raise trans people. They say, I am a girl, use she, her pronouns. And you're like, no, you're a boy. No, you're a boy. This commenter goes on to say, I think as a parent, you shouldn't push the kid clearly to a gender. Yes, this is what most mental health professionals believe. The best way to raise a transgender child, or any child for that matter, is through supportive parenting. One study of 433 trans participants found a 93% reduction of suicide when parents were supportive. So what does this look like? It means allowing them to choose without pressure or unspoken messages the clothes that they wish to wear, how and with whom to play, their favorite toys, the accessories they favor, the manner in which they wear their hair, and the decorations and images in which they surround themselves with. This also means challenging those that are disrespectful and unkind to your child. It's also beneficial to have open and honest communication, just like you would with any other child. This last comment is about politics and requires a political response.
It seems nitpicking, but something I don't like about the left is that they miss out on men's problems by, creating the National Task Force to end sexual and domestic violence against women. I think it should stop sexual and domestic violence against everybody. Everybody should be safe. Men, women, children, everyone.
This person seems to be asking in good faith, but there's something about this that needs to be confronted as far as the wider zeitgeist. There's an article about systemic racism, but what about racism against white people? There's an article about abuse against women, but what about abuse against men? There's a video about LGBT folk, but what about us straight people? There's an issue with this line of questioning as far as most cis white males are concerned. We don't have the same experiences as those other groups, so we assume that they are equivalent and happen equivalently, but it's really a false equivalence. But that's not even the real issue. Let me try to make an analogy the best I can that most of you can understand. You're walking with your friend and telling him how you're upset that your cable had to be cut off because, despite working full-time, you still couldn't make this month's rent without sacrificing it. Your friend responds by saying, "Yeah, well, I'm upset because my dad's stocks fell 15%, and I don't know how we're going to be able to keep our third yacht that he was going to give to me." You're probably going to feel a little bit of anger towards your friend. That anger is invalidation or feeling unheard, and that's why snowflakes, SJWs, the left, or whatever the kids are calling them nowadays, will often express anger at these statements. Invalidation isn't the only reason. These statements only come up during discussion of those other groups, never independently. There's never any action either. It's not like someone who's like, "What about heterosexuals?" actually starts something to improve heterosexual relationships. And so it comes across as disingenuous. And its only use seems to be to minimize those other groups' efforts at getting their voices heard. It doesn't mean that this commenter specifically was trying to be disingenuous, but they likely heard that statement from somebody who was disingenuous, just trying to quote-unquote win an argument. Now the commenter is right that everyone should be safe, and that there should be something set up for domestic abuse against men. The thing is, there already is. The National Domestic Violence Hotline does not discriminate. Rainbow House and RAINN have hotlines and resources as well. MaleSurvivor.org also has some resources and a directory. I'll leave a link in the description. In the last part of this discussion, we need to remember that whenever we're talking about just about any group, it's better to bring them to the table when we are discussing them. There's an old thought experiment called Mary's Room that suggests that an experience contains information. I'm a cis, hetero, white male. I don't have the experiences of a trans person, so I can't know everything there is to know about a trans person. That's why it's good to listen to people who do have those experiences, because they are bringing additional information to the table. Again, there's 50 years of research and discussion on this topic, and most of us are only just now hearing about it. On top of that, trans people aren't tables. We aren't talking about inanimate objects here. Trans people are human beings, and they're often targeted in violence. That violence often stems from fear, uncertainty, and ignorance. So this is why we need to listen to them when we're having discussions about them. I'm going to end the video here. I tried to get to the most common comments and misunderstandings. I hope I was able to shed some light on the subject. And again, some links are in the description to check out. Thank you for listening.
I'm afraid there's a tendency among some philosophers to suppose that philosophical investigations into race, gender, disability, trans issues, and so forth are no different methodologically from investigations into the question whether tables really exist. One difference, however, is that while tables aren't part of the philosophical conversation, trans people, disabled people, people of color are part of the conversation. Or at least, we think we are. We're here, in the room, and we've suffered from lifelong abuse. When we battered tables show up and start philosophizing, only to find these same erasures and invalidations perpetuated within a philosophical context, we could become more than a little upset. To invite me to a philosophical forum in which I prove my womanhood is to do something far different from inviting me to share my views on mathematical Platonism. Do you understand the risks? It's one thing to spout views about the composition problem with both arrogance and ignorance. It happens. It's annoying. But it's quite another thing to do this when we're talking about people. People who are in the room.